Hi, my name is Brandon Craghead. I was the character artist and one of the technical artists on the game We Went Back. Today I'm going to talk a little about how the alien creature from this game was made. So let's jump right in. Alright, so one of the first things I started doing was just some general sketches to kind of feel out what I wanted the alien to look like. I was playing with silhouette a little bit, then worked in some other detail and just kind of explored some different options. And after I met with our team and we kind of settled on a few different ideas, I ended up kind of settling on an image, something like this as far as the body style goes. I knew I wanted it to be kind of a combination of skeletal and muscle showing, but still be very, very human, but very unhuman. I did take a good amount of inspiration from H.R. Geiger's work in the movie Alien and Aliens, and started playing with the pose a little bit, and thought, okay, I want it to be kind of tall and lurchy, and inside our environment, I wanted it almost to feel like it was too large to be able to actually fit there. Um, Something that I did actually struggle with a little bit was the deciding on what I wanted to do for the head. I settled on that body pretty quickly, but the actual head itself was a little bit more difficult to come up with. So at this point, I took these sketches and headed down into ZBrush and started playing with some ideas here. And again, I very much wanted to use human anatomy and looking at the muscle structure and what would be based on a human, as our alien was meant to be. If you were to imagine what the worst part of humanity would evolve into given enough time, is kind of the direction that our team had decided on. And I brought in this skeleton, and I wanted some of the skeletal structure to show with the muscles here as well. And if we go ahead and take a look at this, the actual skeleton itself, I modified, and with that I was careful to try to keep it still very human. I knew I wanted kind of a reverse knee, is what they typically call it, but if you look at animal anatomy, it's not actually a reverse knee. They still have knees like on cats and horses and dogs and things. The knee is just a little higher up, and then it's actually the ankle. And so the ankle itself rides a little higher, and then they essentially end up walking on their toes. Anyhow, so I wanted to keep that design in mind. And then by the time I started to combine everything and merge things down, it started to take shape pretty well. And if you notice, the head at this point was all still very simple. I wanted kind of a strong set of cheekbones and a very, very angular look in there, but I also wanted it to be kind of undefined and mysterious. And after I got the alien structure about where I was happy with my sculpt, I went in and started using the Z-Remesher brush to draw in some basic directions for where I wanted the geometry to sit, and to kind of work that out, but I still stayed very basic. I just wanted to kind of give direction into where it was going without getting too complex. And what was that beforehand was a pretty dense mesh. At this point, we had about 3 million polygons in on this mesh, which is obviously something that's going to be way too much to animate with or to bring into a game at all. So with this remesher, I brought it down to about this resolution here, which is still about 62,000 polygons, which is still also very heavy, but at least I could bring this into Maya and start to kind of work with it from there. With the Z-Remesher, I worked with several attempts to get that down to about where I wanted the geometry to be, but I wasn't really happy with how it was affecting the small parts like the fingers and the toes and the sharper areas. So I did settle on this resolution here, which is it's about 62,000 points, and that was still easier to work with, but it's not game ready. So I went ahead and exported an FBX and an OBJ, and I went ahead and brought that into Maya. And what I started to do from here was the quad draw. So I basically brought in my model, as you can kind of see here, and I quickly started to really kind of fall in love with the quad draw tool. I'd used it here and there in the past, but not as much as I did on this particular project. And once you you make that model live, you go ahead and select the other geometry and open up the quad draw tool. And this was just a little bit into when I had started, kind of an earlier save point. What I wanted to do is I was focusing on these edge loops, and I wanted to make sure that I had a ring going around the shoulder here. I wanted to make sure I had rings going around the shoulder here to make a nice cap, and I was really paying attention a lot to edge flow and cleanliness there. Something that was a little bit tricky was the ribs, to keep the geometry thick enough here, and where I didn't need as much in the back, I very much worked on where I knew I wanted the geometry to sit first, and then kind of worked back into that. At this point I still had a pretty basic face on it again, and it just kind of felt like it was working, so I just kind of ran with it from there. But over time, as I got a little bit further into it, I pretty much everything, all the geometry here was taken care of. And again, I tried to keep it, some pretty clean geometry, and then I went in and I added some different pieces to kind of show where the muscles might be sitting a little bit higher, and kind of put an emphasis on this with the geometry. Like if you look here, the legs and stuff, the different muscles, I wanted some contours and things in here, so I wanted to kind of keep that in mind for this this lower poly model. So after the model got to be about where I was happy with it, the next step is to go ahead and get this model UV'd and work with his UVs. A software that I like to use is I discovered about a year and a half ago. It's called Rhizome UV, and it's a third-party software that you can actually set a bridge up in Maya, and it's quite a good little program. What's nice about this bridge too is it'll send it right in, and then you can bring it right back over, and it's pretty efficient that way. Okay, so here is the model inside of Rhizome after I have cut up and laid out the UVs. And something to note here is that I did the very best I could to place these seams in a place where they would be less obvious, or there wouldn't be as much pulling or problems with how things looked inside the game. But this seam right in here presented an issue, specifically because I had a stylistic choice that I wanted a skull inside of this kind of a fleshy head, and having a translucent material placed over the top of that. But for rendering reasons, we did not want that to be over the entire body, just basically from the neck up. And we could see a really big difference in the materials right across this seam. It was extremely apparent. So what I ended up doing was I made a collarbone system up here, and that kind of helped that transition just a little bit, actually quite a bit actually. And since I knew I was going to have to bring that in and put that in on the UVs here, I decided at that point to actually take this head and put that on a separate UV tile, because the texel density on this face, where we were going to have some close-ups coming in really closely, this resolution is just too low for that. So this was the first pass on that, and I will go ahead and show the next pass and what the next tile set looked like. Okay, so back in here inside of Maya, I have gone ahead and separated this head out from the body, and have relaid out these UVs, and it looks quite a bit better. There's a little room for everything here, and the head itself will be on another tile, and that resolution is a whole lot better, so that's going to look a lot better for our close-ups. What I've also done is go ahead and put this guy back where he goes. Because they are set up as different materials, these will register differently, so they can appear stacked like this when we go ahead and bring it into Substance Painter. And the other thing to note as well here is we do have this skull here we can take a look at real quick. You can kind of see that skull inside of there. And what I am going to want to do is take that skull and lift it up outside of the head so that it doesn't have any baking issues when we go ahead and bring it into Substance. So you see here is just the skull in the UV layout. Here is the head with the body, and then everything stacked up all together looks super messy, but once we bring it into Substance Painter, because they are all separate materials, they are all separated, which is quite convenient. Okay, so something that's worth mentioning to save a little bit of confusion, there were some revisions that were made over time and basically ended up hopping back between Maya, Substance Painter, back into redoing some UVs, and we made some edits. We had basically decided that along with having to adjust and make this collarbone structure to hide that UV seam, something else that mattered was actually having a mouth. We set out to do blend shapes to get some expressive emotions out of the face, and it just wasn't working without having some kind of a mouth to help that along, especially not really having any eyes or other facial features. So basically what I ended up doing was a quad jaw over the top of this base mesh, and I played with a few different options, as you can kind of see here. They get looking a little kind of Voldemort-y, and maybe not in the best ways. So what ended up happening is that I did that quad jaw over the top, and there were a few attempts here. What I ended up with was something like this, as far as the geometry itself goes. And this is much cleaner than what was there, and what this also allows for is the space for a mouth to be carved in. And that ended up looking something kind of like this, and I took these faces back and just literally extruded them back in, used that to create a mouth bag, and because these edge loops were much more circular, it allowed for some much better blend shapes and animation capabilities. So the result ended up looking like that with the mouth open, which, as you can see, looks much better here. So we are going to hop over into Substance Painter and show you kind of what was happening there. And even though this was after the fact, after already being in Substance Painter, I thought it would be make a little more sense to kind of explain this in advance before we jump over there, instead of hopping back and forth between Maya and Substance Painter and redoing the UVs and then back into Maya again, like we did in the actual production process. This is just a little more streamlined for the video itself here, so we'll go ahead and head back over into Substance now. Alright, here we are in Substance Painter, and see, move the skull up here as I talked about doing, so you can see it in this kind of a translucent material that's been applied to the head. Again, this is with the bone in place that hides that seam a little bit better. And in fact, while we're talking about that, we can take a look at that over here. And again, because these are in different materials, they separate out completely, which is great. So what's been nice about this is the opacity here, if we toggle this, is basically just an opacity mask with a little bit of blur on it to kind of soften the edges there. We do have some height on these bones, which I will explain a little bit more in the body when they're just a little more apparent. It's kind of subtle here. What I did do is I wanted the muscle to look like it's kind of bulging up around the bone a little bit, which means I had to kind of build up a ridge in there. Alright, here we are in Substance Painter. And as you can see, I've lifted the skull up out, as I mentioned earlier. And I do this for two reasons. One, it's one way to avoid some baking errors when we bake out all of the texture sets. But it also it lets me paint on that without having to deal with trying to flip-flop between things in there. So that just makes that a little bit easier. I can paint directly on the surface without having to worry about it too much. And we can see the translucence in the head. So when the skull is lowered back in there, then the the skull will be more apparent through the transparent skin in there. And something that I want to highlight here is the actual the texture on the head. It's kind of an interesting little process. I'm going to go ahead and toggle the opacity mask off just so we can see this just a little bit better. It's something that I've done. If we flip down here to the bottom, first I'll just mention really quick, I also was working with a little bit of a subsurface scattering in here, and you know, that's our whole color in there. But if we go ahead and do that, that makes quite a bit of difference. It just gives it kind of just that glow of skin and the blood within that. So come just back up just a little bit. If we look over here at this fascia layer right in here, what I've done is I've gone and I've painted this mask and turn this guy off in order to really see the effect of this, because everything cascades down just like it would in Photoshop if you're not familiar with Substance Painter. We're just going to go ahead and turn a lot of these others off. And in fact, yeah, if you see without this paint on there, that's pretty bland. That's pretty boring. Let's go back under here, under our muscles layer. And what I've got on this fascia is this height texture's in here, but if we toggle this off, this is just a painted layer. There's no height information in there just yet, and that's where this mask right here comes in. And what I've got set up here is an anchor point, and this anchor point will read upwards. This is the bottom anchor, and so something up above it will be able to read that. I need to have some kind of a generator to pull the information out of that. So what we've got then is this metal edgeware, and if I toggle this off, there's a blur in here as well. I'll show why here in just a second. But this metal edgeware, if I toggle this off, you can see without that blur is kind of doesn't look very good. We put the blur on there, and that helps it out quite a bit, smooths it out quite a bit. But that metal edgeware is what drives the height to actually move here. So if I turn this wear level down, you can see in here just how that completely disappears. And you bring it back up, and there it is. But this is kind of important because I wanted to have a separation here. Not only does it bring texture to this, but because I've got this fascia layer painted, I can reuse this mask as I move upwards. So then I've got this muscle texture, and that is essentially just a texture on the muscles themselves. So this just the red pinkish area. Let me toggle this back on, and again we've got another paint layer, right? And got an anchor point, and you bring that in here. Got another metal edgeware that's doing the same thing. It's reading into this this anchor point, and it's using this mask to drive that. And again, climbing upwards a little bit. This is the part that I actually really enjoyed here. Was I wanted this bulge to exist between the fascia and the muscle. That was something I've been trying to work on and make it look right, kind of dial that in for a good little while there. Basically what we've got though is if we turn all these off, and even go these down here as well. Okay, so we've got a fill layer, and this fill layer is pulling from this fascia face mask, which is down below. And what I'm doing then is the fill carries that information just on a normal, and we go ahead and invert that, and so it pushes it out the other direction, right? So it flips that, and it's all just being driven off of that mask. Put a paint layer in here if I need to kind of paint anything out and kind of edit pieces I don't want to be affected quite as much. And you put the blur on there, and it kind of smooths things out and softens things out. And then that's adjustable down here. And as we move up a little bit, we've got this this fill layer here, also reading off this fascia face mask. And again, we put a blur on it. And what the blur does is it doesn't just fuzz it out, it actually increases the radius of the influence of that. But then what I do is I've got this this fill subtract right here, and this is on a subtract. So if I toggle this, what happens, you can see that effect there, and then blur it, push it back out a little bit, and then this is set to difference mode. You can see this effect it has on here, and then again a paint to kind of edit a few things out, especially here in the forehead, and then a final blur to just kind of smooth everything through. So as we hop over here into the body, there's something else I'd like to highlight, which one of the easiest places to see the difference is down here on the legs and the shins. And what I've got here is basically creating a height difference between the bone and the muscle. And as you can see here, there's not a lot of difference just with this toggled off, but when I turn this on, a little bit of height in the bones, and that helps, adds a little definition there, but it still looks a little flat. So what I've done is I've added this here as well. And it's kind of the same idea with the muscle and the fascia, just in a little bit different fashion. So I turn these off, take a look, and got this base fill, which is pulling off of this bones mask. And there is a mask down here that again is literally just the paint. This is be better if I turn this off. There we go. So basically with these bones and this mask here, that's just paint. And so we're taking this mask here, this anchor point, and we're driving that upwards. And as we do that, we have got, let's bring those back up, this fill base, right? And this is pulling that information up. And normal blend mode, again, we add a little bit of blur, and it spreads that out. Okay, and then what we do is we take that same mask, but we subtract it, and it pops you the direction. And we add a blur to fuzz it out and extend that radius. And then we've got this, again, same mask, but we do the difference on the blend mode there. And then we've got a paint layer that we can go in and edit any little changes there. So it's a nice little way to use one mask to drive several things. So you can, if you just painted something, you can add height later and then add this difference there like that. Alrighty, so there's kind of the secret in there of what I was doing, which, and again, that's applied to all of the bones, right? So that's in the ribs. It adds some definition there. It's working back here. It's also working back up there on the neck, and it just adds that extra, especially from a bit of a distance, just adds that extra little illusion that there's more separation from the bone and the muscle there. So yeah, that's kind of the most of what I wanted to highlight in there. And what we would do next is go ahead and you know, do a good old file export and pop those textures out. And what I like to do is if you author them in 4K, you can always bring them down later, but at least just that way you've got it, and you can see a little more resolution when you're kind of testing things out. So yeah, we export these meshes, export these textures, and basically just select these all. And what we're also working with is an occlusion roughness metallic. an ORM, which is nice because it actually bakes out all three of those into one mask, excuse me, into one texture. Instead of having an ambient occlusion, a roughness, and a metallic, it's all in one multi-channel image there, which makes things a lot more efficient in the engine. So we just would go ahead and hit export and carry that through. Alright, so back here in Maya, I've exported those textures and I have brought them in and connected everything to their appropriate materials. And then the next thing I want to talk about is the blend shapes that I did with this, which is again why that mouth, carving that mouth in there was so important. And what I've done here is basically what you would do is you've got the mouth, just closed in kind of a resting position, and then you would go in and sculpt the extreme pose, or the all the way open, or the full expression, or whatever it is you're after, and then you set up the blend shape, and it basically just combines them. And so then this works on a slider here, and it's pretty great because what the animator can then do is you don't just have the extreme pose of this or that and that's it. You've got this gradient of everything in between, so you can kind of key things differently how you want them to be, and get a little more of that acting out of that. And a lot of times the blend shapes are done by the character artist, as they've spent as much time as they have with the model, and they tend to be able to put those emotions to it as well, and then those can be attached to the rig and be animated. Once again, this has been a breakdown on the Alien model from the game We Went Back by Dead Thread Games. Be sure to check it out on Steam. It is free to play, and go see if you can spot our alien in the game. Thanks again.